Discover how Brazil's most beloved bicycle, once an empire of two wheels, slowly vanished from the streets, revealing a powerful lesson about change and the price of pride. In 1980s Brazil, across every city from north to south, a single object united factory workers, students, children, and adventurers in a silent, universal language. During that period, one company alone sold 2 million bicycles annually. That's practically a new bicycle every 15 seconds, 365 days a year. 10,000 workers moved its production lines daily. Its São Paulo warehouses functioned like a cathedral of steel, with chains, gears, and painted frames rolling out at an incessant pace to supply an entire nation thirsty for movement and freedom. The name emblazoned on those bicycles was recognized by any Brazilian child who had ever dreamed of riding alone for the first time: Monarch. For decades, it wasn't just a brand. It was a promise of childhood, a symbol of independence, an object of desire that transcended generations. But at some point, something began to change. Factories closed, the name faded from storefronts, and that two-wheeled empire, which once dominated 95% of the national market, gradually yielded ground to forces its own leaders refused to acknowledge. This is the story of how Brazil's most famous bicycle began to disappear. It all started far from Brazil, in a small village called Hunestad, in southern Sweden, where a 25-year-old named Birger Svensson opened a modest bicycle shop in 1908. What began as a small family business grew slowly, with the discipline and precision characteristic of Scandinavian artisans, until it became one of Europe's most recognized bicycle brands. The Swedish Monark was synonymous with robustness and reliable engineering. When the world emerged from World War II seeking expansion and new markets, the European company's eyes turned to a tropical country of continental proportions that was still in the early stages of industrialization: Brazil. In 1948, Monark arrived in the Bela Vista neighborhood of São Paulo, initially operating as an importer and assembler of disassembled bicycles shipped directly from Sweden. The model was simple but efficient. Parts arrived in boxes, were assembled on Brazilian soil, and left through the doors of a small operation that barely occupied a rented warehouse. The workforce consisted of immigrant laborers who had arrived in Brazil, bringing with them a culture of hard work. Japanese, Italians, Germans, Poles, and Romanians shared workbenches in the nascent factory, with Brazilian workers who migrated from the countryside in search of employment in the industrial metropolis. In 1951, the company left Bela Vista and definitively established itself in Chácara Santo Antonio, Santo Amaro, in the southern zone of São Paulo. It was there, at that new address, that Monark made the leap that would change everything. In 1952, the company inaugurated its own factory, built from scratch, with Swedish financing and Brazilian ambition. In its first full year of operation, it produced 35,000 bicycles. The following year, that number had already jumped to 60,000. 13 interconnected production warehouses, automated welding on conveyor belts, electrostatic painting. By the standards of Brazilian industry at the time, this was pure avant-garde. With a workforce of 600 employees in 1953, the company grew to 450 workers by 1958, across an area of 26,000 square meters. And what they manufactured there went far beyond simple bicycles. They were building the dream of mobility for a country that didn't even have enough roads to support large-scale automobiles. In the 1960s and 1970s, as Brazil experienced its so-called economic miracle and cities exploded with growth, Monark found the perfect ground to flourish. The country was rapidly urbanizing, and millions of workers needed to move from one point to another in cities without access to cars. The bicycle was the most practical and accessible answer to this problem, and Monark was almost the only answer available. Along with Caloi, its great rival, the two companies controlled about 95% of the national bicycle market between the 1960s and 1990s. There was no real competition. There was a duopoly built on the protection of a closed market and on the strength of brands that became so popular their names became synonymous with the product itself. In Brazil, saying bicycle often meant saying Monark. It was during this golden period that models were born that would become part of the emotional history of an entire country. In 1967, Monarch launched the Monareta, a bicycle with an innovative design that quickly became a cultural phenomenon. Its urban, light, and modern appearance captured the imagination of young people across Brazil. The company invested heavily in advertising, promoting events, cycling groups, and creating a youthful identity around the brand. Then came the Barra Circular, a model with an absolutely unique design, a steel circle integrated into the bicycle frame, an aesthetic solution unprecedented in the market. Gearless and made of carbon steel, it was robust enough to last for decades. The Barra Circular became the most copied model in the history of Brazilian cycling. In 1978, the BMX Monark arrived, introducing a completely new style of cycling to the country, linked to sport, adrenaline, and the American youth culture that was beginning to influence the world. In the 1980s, Monarch reached its historical peak: 2 million bicycles sold per year, 10,000 direct jobs, factories in São Paulo, and later in Manaus. The company seemed invincible, as if all of Brazil depended on it to move, and in a way, it did. But no empire lasts forever. And on the horizon, still invisible to those inside those illuminated warehouses, a storm was brewing. In 1990, Brazil was turned upside down. President Fernando Collor de Mello's government abruptly and radically opened the country's borders to international trade, a move that forever transformed the structure of national industry. Overnight, foreign products that were previously prohibited or prohibitively taxed began to arrive on Brazilian shelves at competitive prices. For entire sectors of the economy, it was a brutal shock, a game changer that no one within the factories protected by the closed market was prepared to face. For Monarch and Caloi, which had grown for decades in a comfortable environment of near monopoly, the commercial opening sounded like a fire alarm in a sleeping building. Suddenly, imported bicycles began to appear on the Brazilian market, with surprising quality and prices similar to those practiced by national brands. Parts and components from Asia arrived at much lower costs than local manufacturers could achieve. The Brazilian consumer, who for decades had had no choice, suddenly found themselves with options, and many chose the new. The impact was immediate, but Monarch, contrary to what might be expected, responded to the crisis with a strategy that at the time seemed intelligent. Instead of trying to compete directly with sophisticated, high-value-added imports, the company decided to focus on what it did best and still dominated comfortably: simple, robust, popular bicycles aimed at the worker who needed reliable and cheap transportation. The gamble made sense in the short term. The market for everyday use bicycles still represented the largest share of sales in Brazil. The Barra Circular continued to be produced, continued to be bought, and continued to be copied by competitors. Monarch maintained its financial health for much of the 1990s, even while gradually losing ground. There was a conservative wisdom in that choice, an idea that the company should protect what it had instead of risking a segment it didn't yet dominate. But what seemed like prudence hid a much deeper problem. While Monarch looked down, protecting its turf, the world around it was changing rapidly and irreversibly. Outside, in the early 1990s, a revolution was happening on the dirt trails of California and rapidly spreading worldwide. The mountain bike, with its robust geometry, wide tires, and multiple gears, was redefining the concept of a bicycle for an entire generation. It was no longer just a means of transport. It was a lifestyle, a statement of identity, a piece of sports equipment. The consumer who once bought a Barra Circular to go to work now wanted something they could take to trails, parks, and weekend adventures. Caloi perceived this movement earlier and, in 1989, launched the first mountain bike produced in Brazil, the Caloi Aspen, anticipating a trend that would sweep the market in the following decade. Monarch tried to respond. It launched its own line of mountain bikes, the M-Bike, with 18 gears. The product existed, but it arrived late and without the same cultural impact that its rival had achieved. More than that, the company seemed not to fully understand what was happening. The mountain bike was not just a new model. It was a clear sign that the market had changed character, that the emerging middle-class Brazilian no longer wanted just a utilitarian bicycle. They wanted experience, performance, and technology. And in this terrain, Monarch still trod with uncertainty. The company that had taught Brazil to cycle was learning to walk again, while others were already running. What further aggravated this equation was a silent change, almost invisible at first, but absolutely devastating over time. China had begun its economic opening and was building industrial capacity unprecedented in human history. Enormous factories in the interior of the Asian country began to produce bicycles and components in volumes that no Brazilian factory could dream of matching, with costs that made any direct competition simply impossible. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, this Chinese production flooded the global market and inevitably arrived in Brazil in increasing quantities. Lower-income consumers, precisely those Monarch had decided to protect as its strategic core, discovered they could buy an imported bicycle for an even lower price than a national one. The ground that seemed safe was giving way beneath their feet. Then came the decisions that sealed the fate of the company as it had been built. Between 2006 and 2008, Monarch closed two of its factories, the Manaus unit and the historic São Paulo unit. Production was consolidated entirely at the Indaiatuba plant in the interior of São Paulo. The move reduced costs but also physically shrank the company. When announcing the closure of the Manaus factory, Monarch's management sent a letter to employees with a phrase that perfectly captured the contradiction the company was living. It stated that it preferred to close the factory rather than make a bad bicycle like those imported from China. It was a declaration of industrial pride, but pride alone doesn't pay salaries or win over consumers who had already migrated to another universe of choices. Sone, a new national competitor that emerged in the early 2000s, took advantage of precisely the space left by the shrinking Monarch. With a more aggressive strategy and lower operational costs, it gained ground in the popular segment that Monarch had claimed as its own. By around 2010, about 50% of Monarch's sales were already of children's, youth, and geared bicycles imported from China and resold with the company's logo. The manufacturer that claimed it preferred to close rather than make a bad Chinese bicycle was, ironically, selling bicycles made in China. The circle closed in a bitter and revealing way. What happens when a company loses not only market share but also identity? When the name on the bicycle no longer represents what was built over decades of sweat and engineering. This was the question Monarch faced in the 2010s, without a clear answer. The company that at its peak employed 10,000 people had transformed into something much smaller, leaner, and more vulnerable. Its factory in Indaiatuba continued to operate, but the pace was incomparable to that of the golden decades. The 2 million bicycles sold per year in the 1980s were now a distant memory, almost impossible to imagine within the same walls where that dream had been built. The Brazilian bicycle market continued to grow in total volume over the decades, especially driven by new consumption habits and the popularization of urban and sports cycling. But this growth primarily benefited other players. International brands that arrived with sophisticated aluminum and carbon fiber models won over higher-income consumers. Imported bicycles from Asia dominated the lower-income segment, and Monarch was squeezed into an increasingly narrow space between these two worlds, unable to position itself clearly in either. Its product line existed, its factory produced, its brand was still recognized, but brand recognition is different from purchase desire. An entire generation grew up knowing what Monarch was, without feeling the urge to buy a Monarch. There was a cruel phenomenon that afflicts declining empires. Nostalgia preserves the name, but does not sustain the business. Collectors began to restore old Monaretas and Barra Circulares with almost religious devotion, returning the original shine to machines from the 1970s and 1980s, treating each piece as an industrial work of art. The market for vintage parts and classic bicycles of the brand moved a passionate and dedicated universe. But this market did not buy new bicycles from the Indaiatuba factory. It bought the past, not the present. The company tried to adapt, launching children's models, expanding the youth line, and keeping the Barra Circular in production for decades as a symbol of continuity. But these initiatives arrived without the disruptive force that the moment demanded. There was no modern equivalent of the Monareta, that product capable of capturing the spirit of a generation and creating a new narrative around the brand. There was no leap of innovation comparable to what the BMX had represented in 1978, when the company surprised the market with an entirely new concept. What existed was survival management, not future building, and relentless time kept passing. The Brazil of the 2010s was a profoundly different country from the one that had made Monark prosper. Accelerated urbanization had transformed cities into hostile environments for cyclists, which paradoxically would, years later, create a movement to rescue urban cycling. But when this movement arrived with force, bringing bike lanes, bike rental apps, and a culture of sustainable mobility, it was global brands and micro-mobility startups that reaped its fruits. Monark watched from afar a revolution that could have been its own, but for which it had not prepared in time. There was also the generational issue of leadership. Companies that survive for decades often carry within them a cultural rigidity that is difficult to overcome. The way Monark had grown, protected by a closed market, oriented towards massive volumes of simple products, created an institutional mindset that viewed innovation with suspicion and bet on repeating what had worked in the past. That letter sent to Manaus employees in 2006, proudly declaring the refusal to manufacture something inferior, was the perfect portrait of this mentality. There was dignity in those words, but there was also a strategic blindness that would prove costly. In the early 2020s, Monark still existed, still produced bicycles in Indaiatuba, was still listed on the Brazilian Stock Exchange under the code BMKS3, and still carried a name that anyone over 40 instantly recognized. In 2024, the company reported a profit of 15 million Brazilian reais, a sign that financial management had found some possible balance within an operation much smaller than it once was. But what remained was no longer the empire that had dared to compare itself to the most modern bicycle in the world in a 1960s advertisement. It was a smaller company, adapted for survival, preserving a legacy that the market had irreversibly resized. The story of Monark is not a story of absolute collapse, like that of empires that disappear overnight. It is something more subtle and, in a way, more painful. It is the story of a company that was too big to see, that the world had become bigger than itself, that confused solidity with immobility, that believed quality was enough to survive, without needing to reinvent the meaning of that quality for each new generation of consumers. From this trajectory, lessons remain that transcend the bicycle market and speak directly to the human condition in the face of change. The first is that no monopoly, however comfortable it may seem, prepares a company for real competition. Market protection can guarantee growth, but it creates an invisible structural fragility that only reveals itself when competition finally arrives. The second lesson is that nostalgia is a dangerous asset. It can preserve a brand in the emotional memory of an entire country, and, at the same time, prevent that brand from finding a new place in the present. When a company begins to live off its past instead of building its future, decline has already begun, even if the numbers don't yet show it. The third lesson is the most difficult to accept. Arrogance disguised as pride can be fatal. Preferring to close rather than adapt is sometimes just a nobler way of saying one is unwilling to learn. Monarch still cycles, but the Brazil that saw it born and grow now cycles on bicycles it failed to build in time. And in every Barra Circular restored by a passionate collector, in every Monareta still rolling down some forgotten rural street, there is a melancholic beauty that summarizes everything. The brilliance of those who were great, and chose to remember instead of starting anew.